On a desolate beach on a small island, the greatest swordsman of the era, Sasaki Kojirō, waited. He was a master, a celebrity of the sword, armed with his famously long and lethal blade, the drawing pole. His opponent was already 3 hours late. Finally, a small boat appeared. From it emerged a man, Miyamoto Musashi, looking more like a disheveled vagrant than a warrior. His hair was unkempt, his clothes were common, and in his hand he held not a gleaming steel katana, but a crude, oversized wooden oar he had carved during the journey. This wasn't just a duel, it was an insult. But this moment wasn't about arrogance, it was about strategy. It was a physical manifestation of a code that would make Musashi the most legendary, undefeated swordsman in Japanese history. This is the story of how that code was forged. Miyamoto Musashi was born into a Japan in turmoil. The Great Sengoku period, the age of warring states, was ending, but the land was still awash with violence, ambition, and thousands of masterless samurai, or ronin, all desperate to carve out a name for themselves. In this brutal world, the young Musashi was not just a participant, he was a force of nature. He fought his first duel and killed his first man at the age of 13. By 16, he was a battle-hardened veteran. In his youth, he was known as a Shura, a demon of carnage. He was tall, immensely strong, and fought with a raw, untamed ferocity that overwhelmed his opponents. He was a perfect killing machine, but he was not yet a master. His early path was paved with the bodies of his rivals. He famously challenged the entire Yoshioka school, the official sword instructors to the shogun. One by one, he defeated the masters of the school, not with elegant technique, but with overwhelming, brutal efficiency. In the final confrontation, he ambushed and slaughtered the entire Yoshioka clan, including their 12-year-old leader. It was a victory, but it was a bloody, dishonorable one that cemented his reputation as a monster. For years, this was his pattern: challenge, kill, and move on. He was undefeated, but his victories were hollow, leaving him with a growing sense of emptiness. He had mastered the act of killing, but he had not yet begun to understand the art of victory. The turning point was not a single event, but a slow, dawning realization. The path of the demon led only to more bloodshed, not to enlightenment. Musashi began a period of intense self-reflection, retreating from the dueling circuit to wander the country as a seeker. It was during this time that his objective shifted. He no longer sought to perfect his kenjutsu, the technique of the sword, but to master hyoho, the far broader science of strategy. He realized that being an expert swordsman was a limited skill, but being a master strategist was a universal one. He saw the connections between the sword fight and every other form of conflict and creation. This was the fundamental leap in his thinking, to stop seeing himself as a duelist and to start seeing himself as a student of a much larger, all-encompassing art of war. He began to understand that the sword, in the hands of a true master, was not merely a tool for killing, but a tool for perfecting the self. He started to study other arts, seeking the universal principles that connected them. In the discipline of Zen meditation, he learned to calm his mind. In the art of calligraphy, he learned that the most powerful brushstroke is the one made with a clear, focused, and unhesitating spirit, the same spirit required for a fatal sword strike. He discovered that the path to mastering the sword was not through endless fighting, but through a mastery of the mind. He began to formulate his code that every art, every craft, every aspect of life was governed by the same underlying principles of strategy, timing, and psychological clarity. He trained not just his body, but his spirit. He learned to see beyond the surface of a conflict, to understand his opponent's intentions, their fears, and their weaknesses. His sword became an extension of his will, a tool to express a deeper understanding of the world. The demon was being forged into a philosopher. This transformation was put to the ultimate test on that beach against Sasaki Kojirō. Kojirō was everything the young Musashi was not: polished, celebrated, and a master of a single, perfect technique: the lightning-fast swallow cut, a downward strike followed by an immediate upward slash, so named because it was said to be fast enough to strike a swallow in flight. The duel was the most anticipated showdown of the era, arranged by a powerful lord, and the stakes were absolute. Musashi's strategy began long before he even arrived on the island. Arriving 3 hours late was a calculated act of psychological warfare, designed to fray the nerves of the punctual, disciplined Kojirō. As the sun began to rise higher in the sky, Kojirō's frustration and anxiety grew, draining his focus and filling him with contempt. When Musashi finally appeared, his shabby appearance was another psychological blow, a profound show of disrespect that enraged his opponent. And then there was the weapon. During the boat ride, Musashi had taken a spare oar and calmly carved it into a bakken, a wooden sword. Crucially, he had shaped it to be longer than Kojirō's famous longsword. When Kojirō, in a fit of rage at the sight of this crude weapon, drew his beautiful blade and cast away his scabbard, Musashi sealed his fate with a legendary taunt: "If you have no more use for your scabbard, you are already dead." He had won the fight before it even began. He had used his opponent's mind as his weapon. The actual clash was brief. Musashi used his weapon's superior length and durability to break both Kojirō's rhythm and his spirit, striking the final blow while positioning himself with the sun at his back, blinding his rival. It was a masterclass in total strategy. In his later years, Musashi put down his sword for the final time. He retreated to a cave, not to hide, but to teach. There he picked up a brush and wrote down the entirety of his code in a manuscript that would become one of the most influential books on strategy ever written: Go Rin no Sho, or the Book of Five Rings. It was not a manual on sword techniques, it was a guide to the art of victory itself. He broke down his philosophy into 5 scrolls, or rings. The Book of Earth was the foundation, teaching that one must master the basics of their craft. The Book of Water represented adaptability, the need to be fluid and formless like water. The Book of Fire was about the heat of battle, the strategies for attack and conquest. The Book of Wind was about knowing your enemy, understanding and dismantling other schools of thought. And finally, there was the Book of the Void. This was his ultimate teaching, that to achieve true mastery, one must empty their mind of all ego, fear, and hesitation, reaching a state of no mind, where actions become spontaneous, intuitive, and perfect. This was the source of his power. This focus on the individual's mind is what separates Musashi's code from other legendary texts on strategy, like Sun Tzu's The Art of War. Sun Tzu wrote for generals, teaching them how to maneuver armies and win wars by avoiding battle if possible. Musashi, however, wrote for the individual warrior, the duelist, the person standing face to face with a single deadly opponent. His code was not about commanding others, it was about conquering the self. It was a deeply personal, psychological approach to conflict. He wasn't just Japan's greatest swordsman, he was a man who had decoded the human mind under pressure. Today, his Book of Five Rings is required reading not just for martial artists, but for corporate executives, military leaders, and strategists around the world, all seeking to understand the timeless code of a man who turned the art of the duel into a philosophy for life. And that is the architecture of the code of Miyamoto Musashi. Remember, History is more than a story, it's a code. And there is always another layer to decrypt. Subscribe and continue the investigation with us.